Nancy Miller rubbed her tired eyes as she checked the vitals of her last patient for the night. The emergency room at Memorial General Hospital had been unusually busy. 3 major car accidents, a heart attack, and several other emergencies had kept her running nonstop for 12 hours straight. Her feet ached, her back hurt, and all she wanted was to go home and sleep. "You did great tonight, Nancy," said Joe, a fellow nurse who was getting ready for the day shift. "That man with the heart attack would not have made it without you." Nancy smiled weakly. "Thanks, Joe. It's been a long night." She had been working as an emergency room nurse for 15 years now. The hospital was always short-staffed, especially during night shifts. This week was even worse because several nurses were out sick with the flu. Nancy had volunteered to cover for Mary, whose 5-year-old son had come down with a high fever. This was her 3rd night shift in a row, and her body was begging for rest. The hospital clock showed 6:30 a.m. as Nancy finished writing her notes. She gathered her things from her locker, looking forward to a hot shower and her comfortable bed. Her apartment was only a 15-minute drive from the hospital. If traffic was light, she could be asleep by 7:30. Just as she was walking to her car, her phone rang. Nancy almost ignored it, but then saw it was an unknown number. It might be important. "Hello?" she answered, trying to keep the tiredness out of her voice. "Is this Nancy Miller?" asked a formal-sounding woman. "Yes, this is she. This is Debbie Johnson from the county courthouse. I'm calling about your jury duty today." Nancy froze beside her car. "Jury duty? There must be some mistake. I requested to reschedule because of my work schedule. I sent in the form 3 weeks ago." The woman on the phone sighed. "I'm sorry, Ms. Miller, but we have no record of any rescheduling request. According to our system, you are expected to report for jury selection today at 8 a.m. "But that's impossible," Nancy protested. "I just finished a 12-hour night shift. I haven't slept in almost 24 hours. I'm still in my scrubs." "I understand your situation is difficult," the clerk replied, her voice lacking any real sympathy. "However, failure to appear for jury duty can result in a fine of up to $1,000 or even a contempt of court charge. The judge is very strict about attendance." Nancy leaned against her car, feeling defeated. "Is there any way I can come in later today? Or maybe tomorrow?" "I'm afraid not. Judge Peters has a full docket, and this jury selection must be completed. Today you need to be here by 8 a.m. Nancy looked at her watch. It was already 6:45 a.m. Even if she drove home now, she wouldn't have time to shower, change, and make it to the courthouse by 8 a.m. "Fine," she said with a sigh. "I'll be there." After hanging up, Nancy sat in her car for a moment, fighting back tears of frustration. She was beyond exhausted, and now she had to spend who knows how many hours at the courthouse instead of getting much-needed rest. She took a deep breath, started her car, and headed toward the county courthouse instead of her apartment. The morning traffic was heavier than usual due to road construction. Nancy tapped her fingers nervously on the steering wheel as she watched the minutes tick by. She stopped at a drive-through coffee shop and ordered the largest coffee they had, hoping the caffeine would help her stay alert during the jury selection process. As she drove, Nancy glanced at herself in the rearview mirror. Her light blue scrubs had small stains from the night's work. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and dark circles underlined her eyes. She had no makeup with her, not that it would help much with how tired she looked. Nancy arrived at the courthouse at 7:50 a.m., just barely on time. She parked in the public lot and hurried toward the large stone building. The courthouse was an imposing structure, with tall columns and wide steps leading to heavy wooden doors. People in business suits and formal attire streamed in alongside her, making Nancy even more aware of her inappropriate clothing. Inside, she followed the signs to courtroom 4B, where a small crowd had already gathered. Nancy approached the check-in desk where a clerk was collecting jury summons. "Name?" the clerk asked without looking up. "Nancy Miller." The clerk checked a list and handed Nancy a juror badge. "Put this on and take a seat. The judge will enter soon." Nancy pinned the badge to her scrubs and looked around for an empty seat. The wooden benches were filling up quickly. She spotted an empty space in the back row and made her way there, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. A man in an expensive suit gave her a strange look as she sat down beside him. He shifted slightly away, as if worried her scrubs might somehow contaminate his clothing. Nancy pretended not to notice and took a sip of her coffee instead. At exactly 8 a.m., a side door opened, and a bailiff entered the courtroom. "All rise. For the Honorable Judge Frank Peters," he announced. Everyone stood as the judge entered. He was a tall man in his 60s, with silver hair and a stern face. His black robes swished as he walked to the bench and sat down. "Be seated," he said, his voice deep and commanding. As people settled back into their seats, Judge Peters surveyed the room. His eyes moved from face to face, seemingly evaluating each potential juror. When his gaze reached Nancy, it stopped. His eyebrows drew together in a frown. "Before we begin the selection process," Judge Peters said, "I want to remind everyone that this is a court of law. When you are called for jury duty, you are expected to dress and behave appropriately." His eyes remained fixed on Nancy as he spoke. Several people turned to look in her direction, making her shrink into her seat. The clerk began calling names for roll call. Nancy hoped that somehow her name would be skipped, that there would be enough other jurors and she could slip away unnoticed. But when the clerk called Nancy Miller, Judge Peters held up his hand. "Ms. Miller," he called out, his voice echoing through the now silent courtroom. "Please stand." Nancy's heart pounded as she stood up. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. "Ms. Miller, do you think this is an appropriate way to present yourself in my courtroom?" Judge Peters asked, gesturing to her scrubs. Nancy's throat felt dry. "Your Honor, I apologize for my appearance. I just finished a 12-hour night shift at Memorial General Hospital and I didn't ask for your life story, Ms. Miller." The judge interrupted. "I asked if you thought your attire was appropriate for court." Nancy swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor, but I received the call about jury duty just as I was leaving the hospital. There wasn't time to go home and change." Judge Peters looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. "So you believe that your convenience is more important than showing proper respect for this court?" Nancy could feel her face growing hot, with embarrassment. "No, Your Honor, that's not what I meant." "What exactly did you mean then?" the judge pressed. "Do you think that because you're a nurse, you're somehow exempt from the standards that apply to everyone else?" A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. The man in the suit beside Nancy was now looking at the judge with a slight frown. "No, Your Honor," Nancy said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her exhaustion and growing frustration. "I respect the court. I just had no other option if I wanted to fulfill my civic duty today." Judge Peters shook his head. "This is a court of law, Ms. Miller, not a hospital cafeteria. Your lack of planning does not constitute an emergency for this court. I should excuse you right now for your disrespect." Nancy stood there, feeling a mix of shame and anger. She had spent the entire night saving lives, had come straight to court without sleep because she took her civic responsibilities seriously, and now she was being publicly humiliated. Something changed in her expression as she looked directly at Judge Peters. The fatigue was still there, but now there was also a quiet determination in her eyes. Nancy stood tall despite her exhaustion. The courtroom was completely silent. Everyone watched as she faced Judge Peters, who continued to look at her with disapproval. "Ms. Miller," Judge Peters said, "perhaps you don't understand the seriousness of these proceedings. This is not some casual meeting, this is a murder trial. A man's future hangs in the balance." Nancy's hands trembled slightly, but she kept them at her sides. She was used to pressure in the emergency room, but this was different. In the ER, she was respected for her knowledge and skills. Here she was being treated like a disobedient child. "I understand completely, Your Honor," Nancy replied. Her voice was quiet but clear. "I take my responsibilities very seriously, both as a nurse and as a potential juror." Judge Peters raised an eyebrow. "Your attire suggests otherwise. Do you show up to important job interviews in those clothes? Would you attend a funeral dressed like that?" A few people in the jury pool shifted uncomfortably. Nancy noticed an older woman a few seats away giving her a sympathetic look. "No, Your Honor," Nancy admitted. "But this was not a planned appearance. I came here directly from saving lives because I was told I had to be here by 8 a.m. or face legal consequences. Judge Peters waved his hand dismissively. Everyone has obligations, Ms. Miller. Everyone has jobs. Yet somehow the other 50 people in this room managed to dress appropriately. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Diane, looked up from her desk. She seemed uncomfortable with the way the judge was speaking to Nancy. Your Honor, Diane said hesitantly, there may have been a mistake with Ms. Miller's paperwork. We have no record of her rescheduling request, but that doesn't mean she didn't submit one. Judge Peters turned his stern gaze to the clerk. That's not relevant to the issue at hand, Diane. The issue is respect for this court. He turned back to Nancy. Tell me, Ms. Miller, what emergencies did you handle last night that were so important you couldn't take 15 minutes to change your clothes? Nancy took a deep breath. She hadn't expected to be questioned about her work. For a moment, she considered simply apologizing again and hoping the judge would move on. But something inside her refused to let her profession be dismissed so easily. Last night, Your Honor, I helped treat 3 victims of a serious car accident. On Highway 16, a young man had a punctured lung. I assisted the doctor in inserting a chest tube that saved his life. Judge Peters began to speak, but Nancy continued. After that, I spent 2 hours with an elderly man having a severe heart attack. We stabilized him and got him to surgery. His wife of 50 years thanked me with tears in her eyes. The courtroom remained silent. Some people were now looking at Nancy with newfound respect. Around 3:00 a.m., a teenage girl was brought in after attempting suicide. I cleaned and bandaged her wounds, then sat with her until the crisis counselor arrived. She had no family with her. Nancy's voice grew stronger as she spoke. At 5:30 a.m., a baby with a high fever had a seizure in our waiting room. I helped bring the fever down and comforted the terrified parents until the pediatrician could see them. She looked directly at Judge Peters. Then I got the call that I had to be here by 8 a.m. I didn't have time to go home and change if I wanted to follow the court's orders. So I came here directly without sleep, because I respect the law and I take my civic duty seriously. The man in the expensive suit who had moved away from Nancy earlier was now looking at her with an expression of respect. Several other potential jurors were nodding slightly. Judge Peters's face remained stern, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps a hint of uncertainty. Your work is admirable, Ms. Miller, he said, his tone still formal, but less harsh. However, it does not excuse— Your Honor, a voice interrupted from the front row. A middle-aged man in a gray suit stood up. If I may speak? Judge Peters frowned at the interruption. And you are? Alan Green, Your Honor. I'm an attorney, though not involved in this case. I'm here for jury duty like Ms. Miller. The judge nodded reluctantly. What is it, Mr. Green? I believe there's precedent that supports Ms. Miller's position. The state Supreme Court ruled in Henderson v. County of Riverside that essential workers, coming directly from emergency shifts, cannot be penalized for their attire in court proceedings. Judge Peters looked surprised. I'm not familiar with that case. Alan Green nodded. It's relatively recent, Your Honor. 6 months ago. The court recognized that emergency personnel sometimes must choose between fulfilling their civic duty and meeting dress code requirements. They ruled in favor of accommodating essential workers. Nancy looked at the attorney with gratitude. She hadn't known about this ruling. Judge Peters was silent for a moment. He seemed to be considering this new information. Even if such a ruling exists, the judge finally said, it doesn't change the fact that a certain level of decorum is expected in my courtroom. Another voice spoke up, this time from the back of the room. An elderly woman with silver hair and a floral dress stood. Your Honor, may I say something as well? Judge Peters sighed. This is highly irregular, but go ahead, ma'am. My name is Betty Johnson. I'm a retired teacher. Last year, my husband collapsed at home. The paramedics and emergency room nurses saved his life. They were wearing clothes just like Ms. Miller's. Betty's voice trembled slightly with emotion. When I see those scrubs, I don't see disrespect. I see dedication. I see people who work long hours doing difficult jobs that the rest of us couldn't handle. Several people nodded in agreement. A young man in a business suit spoke without standing. My sister is a nurse. She works 12-hour shifts too. Those scrubs are her professional uniform, just like your robes are yours, Judge. The atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. What had started as one woman being scolded had somehow transformed into a discussion about respect, professional dedication, and what really mattered in a courtroom. Nancy remained standing, surprised by the support, but still exhausted. The coffee she had grabbed on the way to court was wearing off, and she swayed slightly on her feet. The clerk noticed. "Your Honor," Diane said, "perhaps Ms. Miller could sit down. She mentioned she's been working all night." Judge Peters nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Ms. Miller, please be seated." Nancy sat down, grateful to be off her feet. The man in the expensive suit who had moved away from her earlier now leaned over. "I'm sorry about earlier," he whispered. "My wife is a doctor. I should have been more understanding." Nancy gave him a tired smile but didn't have energy for more conversation. Judge Peters cleared his throat. The courtroom fell silent again. "Let's move on with the jury selection process," he said. "Ms. Miller, you will remain in the pool for now." The clerk began calling other names. As the process continued, Nancy struggled to stay awake. Her eyelids felt heavy, and the voices around her sometimes seemed far away. She pinched her arm several times to stay alert. During a brief recess, the prosecutor and defense attorney approached the bench to speak with Judge Peters. They spoke in low voices but occasionally glanced in Nancy's direction. Nancy wondered if they were discussing her. When court resumed, Judge Peters addressed the jury pool again. "After consultation with counsel, I've made some decisions about today's proceedings." He looked at Nancy. "Ms. Miller, approach the bench, please." Nancy's heart raced as she stood and walked to the front of the courtroom. Her legs felt like lead. As she stood before the judge, she noticed something different in his expression. The sternness was still there, but there was also something else, perhaps a hint of regret. "Ms. Miller," Judge Peters said, his voice lower now, meant only for her and the attorneys to hear. "It has been brought to my attention that your presence here today represents an extraordinary effort on your part." Nancy waited, unsure where this was going. Both the prosecution and defense have agreed that, under the circumstances, you should be excused from jury duty today with the option to reschedule for a more convenient date. Relief washed over Nancy. She could finally go home and sleep. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said sincerely. Judge Peters wasn't finished. "However, before you go, I have something else to say." Nancy stood at the bench waiting for Judge Peters to continue. The courtroom was quiet. Everyone seemed curious about what the judge would say next. "Ms. Miller," Judge Peters said, his voice still low but now audible to the first few rows of the courtroom. "I believe I owe you an apology." Nancy blinked in surprise. This was the last thing she had expected to hear. "My comments earlier were inappropriate," the judge continued. "I made assumptions about your character based solely on your appearance, which goes against the very principles of fairness that this court is meant to uphold." The prosecutor, a woman in her 40s named Karen Wright, nodded slightly in approval. The defense attorney, Paul Bennett, looked equally satisfied with the judge's words. "Thank you, Your Honor," Nancy said quietly. "I appreciate that." Judge Peters wasn't finished. "However, there's something else I'd like to say, and I think it should be said publicly." He turned to address the entire courtroom. His voice returned to its full authoritative volume. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to make something clear to everyone present. This court made an error today. Or rather, I made an error. I failed to recognize that respect comes in many forms." People in the jury pool sat up straighter, surprised by this unexpected turn of events. Ms. Miller came to this court directly, from a night shift at Memorial General Hospital. She came here, despite her exhaustion, because she respects our legal system enough to prioritize her civic duty. The fact that she is wearing scrubs is not a sign of disrespect. It is evidence of her commitment to both her professional responsibilities and her duties as a citizen. Nancy felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She was so tired that tears threatened to form in her eyes, but she blinked them away. Judge Peters continued, "In light of this, I am going to make 2 announcements. First, Ms. Miller is excused from jury duty today and will be allowed to reschedule at her convenience." Nancy let out a small sigh of relief. Sleep was only a car ride away now. "Second," the judge said, "I am instituting a new policy in this courtroom. From this day forward, emergency services personnel coming directly from their shifts will be exempt from the standard dress code requirements. Their uniforms will be recognized as professional attire, just as attorneys are permitted to wear their suits and I wear these robes." A murmur of approval spread through the courtroom. The clerk, Diane, was smiling broadly. Even the usually serious-faced bailiff nodded in agreement. "Ms. Miller," Judge Peters said, turning back to Nancy, "you are free to go. Thank you for your service, both here and at the hospital." "Thank you, Your Honor," Nancy said, feeling a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion. As she turned to leave, something unexpected happened. Betty Johnson, the retired teacher who had spoken up earlier, began to clap. The sound of her hands coming together seemed loud in the formal courtroom. Then Alan Green, the attorney, joined in. Within seconds, most of the people in the jury pool were applauding. It wasn't thunderous, this was still a courtroom after all, but it was a clear show of support. Judge Peters did not bang his gavel to stop it. Instead, he watched with a thoughtful expression as Nancy made her way to the exit. The bailiff opened the door for her, offering a respectful nod as she passed. In the hallway outside, Nancy leaned against the wall for a moment, letting the events of the morning sink in. "Ms. Miller?" Nancy turned to see Karen Wright, the prosecutor, walking toward her. "That was quite something in there," Karen said with a smile. "Not many people stand up to Judge Peters like that." Nancy shook her head. "I didn't mean to cause a scene. I just couldn't let him dismiss what I do." "Well, you made an impact. Judge Peters rarely admits he's wrong about anything." Karen paused, then added, "My sister works at County General as a nurse. She tells me all the time how hard the job is." "It can be challenging," Nancy agreed, "but it's also rewarding." "You should go home and get some rest," Karen said kindly. "You look like you're about to fall over." Nancy smiled tiredly. "That's exactly where I'm headed." As she walked through the courthouse, Nancy noticed several people looking at her with respect, quite different from the judgmental glances she had received earlier. A security guard at the main entrance even thanked her for her work at the Yar hospital. Outside, the morning sun was bright, making Nancy squint. She was halfway to her car when she heard someone calling her name. "Ms. Miller." "Nancy." She turned to see Alan Green, the attorney who had cited the legal precedent, hurrying toward her. "I wanted to catch you before you left," he said when he reached her. "That ruling I mentioned, Henderson versus County of Riverside, I made it up." Nancy stared at him in surprise. "What? But the judge seemed to believe you." Alan grinned. "That's because judges hate to admit they don't know a case. I took a chance. There should be such a ruling even if there isn't one yet." "But why would you do that for me? You don't even know me." Alan's expression grew more serious. "My daughter was in a bad car accident 2 years ago. The ER nurses kept her alive until the doctors could operate. One of them stayed past the end of her shift, just to hold my daughter's hand because my wife and I were stuck in traffic." He looked at Nancy's scrubs. "When I see someone in those clothes, I remember that night. I couldn't just sit there while the judge disrespected you." Nancy was touched. "Thank you. That meant a lot." "No. Thank you for what you do," Alan replied. "Now go get some sleep, you've earned it." Nancy finally made it to her car. As she sat in the driver's seat, she realized her hands were shaking slightly, partly from exhaustion, partly from the emotional roller coaster of the morning. She took a few deep breaths before starting the engine. The drive home seemed to take forever, though it was only 15 minutes. Nancy kept her windows down, letting the cool air help her stay awake for those final miles. When she finally walked through her apartment door, her cat, Max, greeted her with a loud meow, clearly unhappy about her extended absence. "I know I'm late," Nancy told him as she filled his food bowl. "You wouldn't believe the morning I've had." She didn't even bother to change out of her scrubs before falling onto her bed. Sleep claimed her almost instantly. Nancy woke up in the late afternoon, disoriented at first. The events at the courthouse seemed like a strange dream. Had she really stood up to a judge? Had the entire courtroom really applauded her? She reached for her phone and saw she had several text messages. The first was from Joe, her colleague. "At the hospital. You're famous. Someone from the courthouse told their friend who works in our admin office about what happened this morning. The whole hospital is talking about it. Call me when you wake up." The second message was from Mary, the nurse whose shift Nancy had covered. "Just heard what happened at court. You're my hero. Tommy's fever is down. I'll cover your next shift. You deserve a break." There were 3 more messages from other coworkers, all expressing amazement and support. Nancy sat up in bed, surprised by how quickly the story had spread. She hadn't expected anyone to hear about it beyond those who were present in the courtroom. Her phone rang. It was the hospital's number. "Hello?" Nancy answered, still groggy from sleep. "Nancy, it's Dr. Peterson." Dr. Peterson was the chief of emergency medicine, Nancy's boss. Her heart beat faster. Was she in trouble somehow? "I heard about what happened at the courthouse today," Dr. Peterson said. "I can explain," Nancy began. "No need to explain, Doctor," Peterson interrupted. "I think it's fantastic. Standing up for our profession like that, it's exactly the kind of thing we need more of." Nancy relaxed. "Thank you, Dr. Peterson. Actually, that's why I'm calling. The hospital board has been discussing the need for better public relations and education about what we do. We've been looking for someone to lead a new community outreach program. After hearing about this morning, several board members suggested you might be perfect for the role." Nancy sat up straighter in bed, suddenly much more awake. "A community outreach program? Me?" "Yes," Dr. Peterson confirmed. "We need someone who can speak with authority about what emergency medical professionals do. Someone who can connect with the public and help them understand our work. After what happened today, it's clear you can do that effectively." "I don't know what to say," Nancy replied, genuinely surprised. "I've never thought of myself as a spokesperson." "That's exactly why you'd be perfect," Dr. Peterson said. "You're authentic. You speak from the heart about the work we do. Would you be willing to come in tomorrow afternoon to discuss it? The board would like to meet with you." Nancy agreed to the meeting, still stunned by this unexpected development. After hanging up, she checked her social media accounts and was shocked to find several friend requests from people she didn't know. Searching her name online, she found a post about the courtroom incident that had been shared hundreds of times. Someone named Sam Parker had written, "Witnessed something amazing at the courthouse today. A nurse in scrubs stood up to Judge Peters when he criticized her appearance. She explained all the lives she had saved during her night shift. The whole courtroom applauded her. Nurses deserve respect." The post had dozens of comments, many from other healthcare workers sharing similar experiences of being judged for their appearance while in uniform. Nancy's phone rang again. This time it was a local news reporter asking for an interview. Nancy politely declined, saying she needed more time to rest. 2 more calls from different news outlets followed. Nancy turned her phone to silent and tried to process everything that was happening. Max the cat jumped onto the bed and curled up beside her, purring loudly. "Things are getting crazy, Max," Nancy told him, scratching behind his ears. "All I did was stand up for myself." The next morning, Nancy felt refreshed after a full night's sleep. She made coffee and sat at her small kitchen table, thinking about the meeting with the hospital board later that day. What would she say? Did she even want this new role? Nancy had always loved the hands-on aspect of nursing, the direct patient care, the immediate impact she could have on someone's life. Public relations seemed far removed from that. Yet she couldn't deny feeling a spark of excitement at the possibility of advocating for her profession on a larger scale. As she was getting ready to leave for the hospital, Her doorbell rang. Nancy opened the door to find Betty Johnson, the retired teacher who had spoken up for her in court. "Miss Johnson," Nancy exclaimed in surprise. "How did you find me?" Betty smiled warmly. "I hope you don't mind. I asked around at the hospital. I volunteer in the gift shop twice a week, so I know a few people there." Nancy invited her in. Betty politely declined coffee but sat at the kitchen table with Nancy. "I wanted to thank you," Betty said. "What you said in that courtroom yesterday, it needed to be said. My late husband was a nurse for 40 years. He faced that same attitude his entire career." "I'm sorry to hear that," Nancy said. Betty nodded. "People don't understand what healthcare workers go through. They don't see the long hours, the emotional toll, the physical exhaustion. They just expect you to be there when they need you. It's part of the job," Nancy said simply. "But it shouldn't come with disrespect," Betty insisted. "That's why what happened yesterday matters. You changed at least one mind, the judges, and who knows how many others." They talked for a while longer. Betty shared stories about her husband's nursing career, and Nancy found herself opening up about her own experiences. When Betty finally left, she hugged Nancy and made her promise to stay in touch. Later that afternoon, Nancy arrived at the hospital for her meeting with the board. She had decided to wear professional clothes rather than scrubs, choosing a simple, blue dress and low heels. She felt nervous but also curious about what they would propose. The hospital's boardroom was intimidating, a long table surrounded by important-looking people in business attire. Dr. Peterson greeted her warmly and introduced her to everyone. Among them was a face Nancy recognized, Karen Wright, the prosecutor from court. "Ms. Wright," Nancy said in surprise. "I didn't expect to see you here." Karen smiled. "I'm on the hospital's Community Advisory Committee. When I heard they were considering you for this new program, I asked to be included in the meeting." The board chair, a serious man named Richard Gomez, called the meeting to order. He explained that the hospital had been planning a community outreach initiative for months. The goal was to improve public understanding of emergency medicine and to strengthen the hospital's relationship with the community. "We've been looking for the right person to lead this effort," Mr. Gomez said. "Someone who could be the face of the program." After hearing about what happened at the courthouse, several board members suggested you might be perfect for the role. Dr. Peterson added, "What impressed us most was your ability to explain complex medical work in terms anyone could understand, and to do it with passion and authenticity." Nancy listened as they outlined their vision. Educational sessions at schools and community centers, a monthly column in the local newspaper, occasional television appearances, and a new podcast about emergency medicine. "We're not asking you to give up nursing," Dr. Peterson assured her. "This would be a part-time role, perhaps 2 days a week. You could still work shifts in the ER." Nancy was relieved to hear this. She couldn't imagine leaving patient care entirely. "We understand this is a lot to consider," Mr. Gomez said. "You don't need to decide today." "Actually," Nancy said, surprising herself, "I think I would like to do this, but I have one condition." The board members looked at her expectantly. "I want to focus on respect for all healthcare workers, not just doctors and nurses. The cleaning staff, the receptionists, the technicians, everyone who makes a hospital work deserves recognition." Mr. Gomez nodded. "I think that's an excellent suggestion." As they discussed the details, Nancy found herself growing more excited about the possibilities. She could use this platform to advocate for better understanding of healthcare professionals and their needs. After the meeting, Karen Wright approached Nancy. "There's something else you should know," Karen said. "Judge Peters has been talking about your case. He's considering a formal change to the court's dress code policy to accommodate essential workers coming from shifts." Nancy was surprised. "Really? I thought his announcement in court was just for his courtroom." Karen shook her head. "He's taking it to the presiding judge. He wants it to be a countywide policy. Your stand might change things for a lot of people." As Nancy walked through the hospital corridors, several colleagues stopped her to offer congratulations and support. Word had spread quickly about her confrontation with the judge and now about her new role with the outreach program. In the ER, Joe greeted her with a big smile. "There she is, our celebrity nurse." Nancy laughed. Hardly a celebrity. Are you kidding? You're all over social media. Nurses, deserve respect is trending locally. You've started a movement. Nancy shook her head in disbelief. All I did was stand up for myself. Sometimes that's all it takes, Joe replied. One person refusing to back down can change things for everyone. As Nancy prepared for her shift, she thought about everything that had happened since yesterday morning. What had started as a simple misunderstanding about jury duty had somehow turned into something much bigger. She had never sought attention or recognition. She had just wanted to do her job and be treated with respect. Now she had a platform to advocate for that respect on behalf of all healthcare workers. A new patient was brought in, an elderly man with chest pain. Nancy put all other thoughts aside and focused on her immediate task. This was still the work she loved most, helping people directly, making a difference in their most vulnerable moments. Later that evening, as her shift was ending, Nancy received a surprising visitor to the ER. Judge Frank Peters himself stood at the nurse's station looking somewhat out of place in his casual clothes. Ms. Miller, he said when he spotted her. I hoped I might find you here. Nancy approached him cautiously. Judge Peters, is everything all right? Are you ill? The judge shook his head. No, I'm perfectly fine. I came to speak with you personally. Nancy led Judge Peters to a small break room away from the busy ER floor. The judge looked different out of his robes, more approachable in slacks and a button-down shirt. His expression was serious but not stern like it had been in the courtroom. I wanted to speak with you privately, Judge Peters said as they sat down at a small table. What I said in court yesterday wasn't enough. Nancy wasn't sure what to expect. Your apology seemed sincere, Your Honor. Frank, please. We're not in court now. The judge sighed deeply. The apology was sincere, but it was also professional. I've been thinking about our encounter all day, and I felt I needed to explain myself better. Nancy waited, curious about what more he could have to say. My wife was a nurse, Judge Peters said quietly. She worked in the ER at County General for 30 years. She passed away 2 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss, Nancy said, surprised by this personal revelation. The judge nodded. She used to come home with stories very similar to what you described in court. The car accidents, the heart attacks, the frightened children. She would work 12-hour shifts and still find energy to care for our family. His voice grew softer. When I saw you in those scrubs yesterday, you reminded me so much of her, and instead of recognizing that, I reacted poorly. I think perhaps I've been trying to put distance between myself and anything that reminds me of her. Nancy hadn't expected such a personal explanation. That must be very difficult for you. It is, Judge Peters agreed. But that's no excuse for how I treated you, especially since I of all people should understand the sacrifices healthcare workers make. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He handed it to Nancy. It showed a younger Judge Peters with a smiling woman in nursing scrubs, her arm around his waist. That's Margaret, he said. She wore scrubs like yours with such pride. She always said they were her work uniform, just as my robes were mine. Nancy looked at the photograph. The woman had kind eyes and a warm smile. She handed it back to the judge. She looks like she was a wonderful person. She was, Judge Peters said, returning the photo to his pocket. And I dishonored her memory with my behavior yesterday. He straightened in his chair. But that's not the only reason I came here today. I wanted to let you know personally that the court policy is changing. This morning I met with the presiding judge and several other judges from the county. We've drafted a new policy that recognizes the professional attire of emergency services personnel, healthcare workers, and others who may be called to court directly from their shifts. Nancy smiled. That's wonderful news. It's just the beginning, Judge Peters continued. The experience made me realize how many other biases might be built into our court system. We're forming a committee to review all our procedures with an eye toward making the courts more accessible and respectful to everyone. And you came all the way here to tell me this? Nancy asked. Judge Peters nodded. I thought you deserved to hear it directly from me. Your courage in my courtroom has created a ripple effect that's still spreading." As they continued talking, Nancy learned that Judge Peters had been a public defender before becoming a judge. He had once been passionate about justice and fairness, but years on the bench had gradually hardened him. Yesterday's confrontation had been a wake-up call. "Sometimes we need someone to hold up a mirror so we can see what we've become," he admitted. After about 20 minutes, Nancy's pager beeped. "I'm sorry, I need to check on a patient." "Of course," Judge Peters said, standing. "I've taken enough of your time. Thank you for listening." As they walked back toward the ER, they passed Dr. Peterson, who looked surprised to see the judge. "Your Honor," Dr. Peterson said, "I didn't know you were visiting today." "Just a personal matter," Judge Peters explained. "Actually, since you're here, I wonder if I might speak with you as well. I have some ideas about how the courts and the hospital might work together more effectively." Dr. Peterson looked intrigued. "Of course, let's go to my office." Before leaving with Dr. Peterson, Judge Peters turned to Nancy one last time. "Ms. Miller, Nancy, thank you again. Not just for listening today, but for standing up yesterday. It's people like you who remind the rest of us what integrity looks like." With that, he followed Dr. Peterson down the hall, leaving Nancy to return to her patients. Over the next few weeks, Nancy's life changed in ways she never could have anticipated. The community outreach program launched with an event at the local high school, where Nancy spoke to students about careers in healthcare. Her natural warmth and authentic passion made her an instant hit with the teenagers. The local newspaper ran a feature story about her confrontation with Judge Peters and the policy changes it had inspired. Other nurses and emergency workers began sharing their own stories of being disrespected because of their uniforms or work schedules. What had started as a personal stand was becoming a movement for greater recognition of essential workers. Nancy still worked in the ER 3 days a week, maintaining the direct patient care that she loved. On her outreach days, she visited schools, community centers, and local businesses, talking about the realities of emergency medicine and the importance of treating all healthcare workers with respect. 1 month after the courtroom incident, Nancy arrived at the hospital to find a special event underway in the main lobby. A banner read Healthcare Heroes Recognition Day, and hospital staff from all departments were gathered together. Dr. Peterson spotted Nancy and waved her over. "There you are. You're just in time." "In time for what?" Nancy asked. "I didn't know about any event today." "That was intentional," Dr. Peterson said with a smile. "We wanted to surprise you." Before Nancy could ask more questions, Dr. Peterson stepped up to a small podium that had been set up in the lobby. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming today. As you know, we're here to celebrate the dedication of all our healthcare workers, from the surgeons to the cleaning staff, from the nurses to the receptionists. Everyone who makes this hospital work deserves recognition." The gathered staff applauded. Nancy noticed several familiar faces in the crowd, including Betty Johnson and Alan Green from the courtroom. Even Joe had come in on his day off. "This celebration was inspired by one of our own," Dr. Peterson continued. "A nurse who reminded our community that respect isn't about what you wear, but about what you do. Nancy Miller, would you please join me?" Surprised and somewhat embarrassed, Nancy made her way to the podium. Nancy's stand in a courtroom 1 month ago has led to real changes in our community, Dr. Peterson explained to the crowd. Not only did the courts change their policies, but her story has inspired healthcare workers across the state to speak up about the respect they deserve. And today, we have a special announcement. He gestured to the back of the lobby where Judge Peters was walking in, accompanied by the mayor and several other officials. The mayor stepped forward with a proclamation in hand. "In recognition of the essential work done by healthcare professionals, every day I am proud to declare the first Monday in June as Healthcare Workers Appreciation Day in our city. This annual observance will begin this year, with special recognition of the professionals who wear scrubs, lab coats, and other uniforms that identify them as the heroes they truly are." The crowd erupted in applause. Judge Peters, standing near the mayor, caught Nancy's eye and gave her a respectful nod. After the ceremony, as people mingled and enjoyed refreshments, Nancy found herself surrounded by colleagues and friends, all congratulating her. But the most meaningful moment came when a young nursing student approached her. "Ms. Miller," the student said shyly, "I just wanted to thank you. I read about what happened in court, and it made me even more proud to be studying nursing. It's important to know that someone will stand up for us." Nancy smiled at the young woman. "What's your name?" "Emma," the student replied. "Well, Emma, remember this. Your uniform is a badge of honor. Never let anyone make you feel less than proud to wear it." As Nancy looked around the lobby, at all, the people in their various uniforms and work clothes, the scrubs, the lab coats, the maintenance uniforms, the administrative attire, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. What had begun as a difficult morning in court had transformed into something powerful and positive. She hadn't set out to be a spokesperson or to start a movement. She had simply stood up for herself and her profession when it mattered. And sometimes, that was enough to change the world, or at least a small corner of it.